On this episode of the podcast, I have with me Kunal Bhattacharya. He is the Director of DevSecOps at American Family Insurance. We're going to be talking all about shifting left of security. Kunal has a really deep background in application security. He's seen the maturation process, and I know he has some thoughts on building the right culture, build versus buy, and the metrics that he's looking at, as well as just moving along the security maturity path and kind of moving towards building a lot more tooling internally. Kunal, thanks for being on.
Thanks, Amir, for having me. Glad to be here.
Absolutely. Thank you. And I mentioned you have an extensive background within application security. That really doesn't do justice. So maybe to kind of set some context for the audience, if you give us a little bit about your background and who you are, that'd be great.
Yeah, absolutely. So I started my career, seems like a long time ago, but I started my career as a developer, full stack, as we call it today. One person taking care of the application development, production support, testing, everything. Then I moved on towards sysadmin role. I did a little bit of DBA work. I was doing some QA work, went back to development, finally moved to security. When I moved to security, I realized that the previous roles that I've had actually helped me understand security much more because I was able to wear different hats and look at things from different angles in order to provide better solutions. I work out of Silicon Valley, and as is the norm, I've worked with a lot of different tech giants out here, including PayPal, eBay, Credit Karma, Symantec, and I joined American Family Insurance a few months back, trying to build the application security and DevSecOps program.
Awesome, man. Awesome. You mentioned the transition. I'm just kind of curious because I know you started off as a developer, and then you've made the transition. When you first made that transition, this was a little while ago, but when you made that first into security, what was your thoughts? Because you see a lot of people who want to go from software to security, and obviously this is a little while ago. Technologies have matured, but just curious back then, how big a shift was that for you?
It was actually not that big a shift because I've always been a curious individual. And for me, doing anything new is always exciting. So when I started my career, I was a consultant at Citibank. Back in the day when security was not even talked about, I thought it was pretty cool when, big companies like Citibank basically hires hackers to break into applications. But I didn't realize it at the time that this is where I will end up working on. So in a way, although it wasn't definitely planned, but it ended up being something that I wanted to do for a long time.
Awesome. I guess kind of as you've had some stop at some pretty big companies along the way, some startups. So you've kind of seen the full gamut of a small company trying to add to their security program. You've seen big companies. I mean, American Family Insurance, you guys are 15,000 plus people there. Obviously, as you've kind of seen this shift when you go from small to big, big to small, I mean, you kind of gone back and forth. What are some of the things that stand out from your perspective in terms of their views on application security shifting to the left? Obviously, the smaller the company, the more dynamic. But what are some maybe the cultural things that you've come across?
Yeah, culture is actually a very important part from the security perspective. And every company has its own culture. And I'm always amazed at how different every company is in terms of culture. In terms of big or small, there are pros and cons on both sides. If you're working for a smaller organization, definitely it's more dynamic. People have to wear multiple hats, which means more learning, but it also means that you get to kind of, be on everything and not always get the depth that you want. And if you're working for a bigger company, you may get the depth. You may also have the budget to, bring in some of the changes that you want. But it's highly possible that it's like moving a big elephant, right? So it takes a lot of time. So you definitely have to have your vision and the roadmap laid out and then act accordingly. So, it's very important for a leader coming in, specifically from a security perspective, to an organization to really get the pulse of the organization. Why that is important specifically for security is because security is not a revenue earner. And for the long time, organizations, boards, they have always looked at security as an added cost without necessarily understanding the benefits that is brought in, because it's always difficult to quantify the number of hacks that have been stopped, the breaches that have been stopped. and correlate it to dollar amounts. But I think the change is happening now. There's definitely a lot of understanding from board perspective as to why companies have to be secure. In fact, I was reading an article a couple of days back about ransomware attack that happened in a hospital in Berlin. And because of that, the hospital systems were hosed and a patient had to be routed to a different hospital. And in this whole situation, the individual died. So the ramifications were pretty high. And it is important to understand the risk tolerance from each organization's perspective. At the same time, understand the culture that the developers are familiar with, especially when you're working in the security, because security as by itself won't be able to do much if there is not much support from the developer community.
Yeah, it's interesting. So I guess just to kind of stay on culture, and again, you can kind of draw on your previous experience or maybe your current. It's I guess your choice. But are you seeing as there's a shift left in including more? You know, you're the director of DevSecOps. DevSecOps is still really new, still burgeoning. But as this movement is kind of shifting security components left, more common tools with, let's say, the DevOps or other engineering teams, are you seeing a shift culturally from security going from being the black box? It's just difficult. They just respond if something goes wrong. They're just they're not a revenue earner to being a little bit more included in other conversations, departments because it's getting more visibility. I mean, are you seeing that at all out there?
It is definitely happening. There's still a long way to go, but earlier the conversations used to be around the development teams coming in and saying, "Hey, we need the approval, a rubber stamp approval from security in order to make this product alive, which will bring us X amount of revenue." Where that puts a lot of pressure on the security teams. Hey, we didn't even know about this product, and you want our blessing, but without the due diligence that comes with it. So what that has forced security teams to do is basically become more proactive, to become more engaged in the process. And kind of, it started off as strong arming itself into the whole process. And over time, depending upon the maturity of the organization, security gets a seat at the front table. So the idea is, as you mentioned rightly about shift left, there was a study conducted by Ponemon Institute a few years back about the cost of fixing a vulnerability is around approximately $8,000 once it goes live. And if you would have found it earlier in the development cycle, earliest, which is basically in the design phase, it is $80. So imagine the dollar amount that is saved. So if we can basically correlate the number of vulnerabilities which are live and then the savings associated, that gives you the justification for some of the changes that you want to be bringing in, whether it's tooling, the culture, the people aspect of it, everything from a security perspective.
Absolutely. Interesting statistic. I mean, it's just that's such a large delta that it should almost make every CIO, CISO be a champion to kind of push it left, obviously. Is that kind of help when you're talking to your boss, and obviously you guys are a larger company at American Family Insurance, and you're talking about investment in the DevSecOps? Is that definitely one of the metrics you like to use out there?
It is definitely one of the metrics. And from a board perspective, it's definitely something that CISOs take back to the board. And as a result of that, there is a lot more awareness from the board perspective because money talks.
Absolutely, absolutely. Yes, it does. Especially trying to save 8,000 to $80. I mean, that's pretty staggering. So, I guess the one thing that kind of goes with that is the shift left, and in terms of if you have an existing company, an existing team, there's certain maybe challenges with that versus if you have if you're a startup and you're the first security person, you're building a team. You obviously, as you mentioned, a little more nimble. You have a lot more options. So talk a little bit about when you have an existing team and you're like, hey, we're going to start incorporating a little bit more engineering principles into your more CI/CD. Obviously, the team might not be quite equipped for that, right? I mean, they might be skills that you're just completely missing at that point.
From a startup perspective, yes, that's definitely one of the challenges. So, from a startup mindset, the first thing is basically to get the product out of the door. That's the mindset that, for a good reason, exists. And as a result of that, a lot of times what ends up happening is basically the quality can potentially get compromised. Now, this is okay from an agile perspective, but you still got to have your basics covered. So you definitely need to have the low hanging fruits covered. So with CI/CD, it actually kind of brings uh, fresh perspective, which even the startups are, for the most part, okay with, wherein you build security into the whole agile process. Now, when we talk about agile, one thing that has always been lacking is security. So you have your architects designing the solution, and then you have the developers doing the coding and the testing, and then release, which is going through the automatic pipeline. But when agile was designed, it did not have security in the mind. So it's basically security having to catch up in that mindset, saying that hey, security needs to be at the table even during the design phase, because a lot of companies end up saying, oh, we need to get the security review done. And now that's a very loaded term. What does it mean by security review? Security review in my head is a bunch of different things, which is, you need to do your architecture reviews, you need to do your design and code reviews, you need to make sure that the application is threat modeled, the risk taken care of and logged, and then the security requirements are basically baked in to the whole development process. And the final stage is essentially the check the box kind of thing where, okay, these are the requirements that were predefined in consultation with the security experts, and we are checking the box saying this was done, this is done. And the concept of trust but verify, wherein you have tests designed to check that these are taken care of.
So it's interesting because obviously that's a whole different wrinkle within the development process. Again, if you're a startup, even if you're a larger company and you haven't looped in security, all of a sudden you have to stop and you have to go back and do the review and make sure everything fits before you go live. Is that some just education that's missing in terms of people maybe don't fully understand the ramification of security and just again it sounds like I've talked to a lot of CISOs that it's security's always been a little more black box. Is some of this just education, do you think?
Well, with startups, while they have to be nimble and they have to be really fast, the one big advantage that startup has is, let's say you're working in a 100% shop, and pretty much everybody knows everybody, the CIO, the CTO. I mean, there's not even, probably all these C-level execs, and maybe people are donning multiple hats. So it's very important to have the relationship, especially on the business and the technical side, to kind of not justify, but align with the values of the organization and the goals of the organization. What I mean by that is we want to be helping the product and the development teams towards getting secure baked into the cycle, right? Right from the phase when the product is being envisioned. Once you get that seat on the table, the pitch here is basically that we would be working to get the security requirements in. We'd also be working on integrating into the CI/CD pipeline. So the trust for but verify model, where we say, okay, you need to make sure that your, for example, your application is output encoded, right? So we check for that, and that's an automated test that you can easily do by any of the tools that are available out there. And another factor is basically the tooling, which is a whole different aspect altogether, because there's a lot of open source tools available, but you need to basically, wedge your bets.
So I guess from a startup perspective, it makes sense. Like there's just a lot more agility. And then you come to a larger organization where I mean there's just process for everything. I mean, you start including compliance and security on top of that, and everything seems to slow down. So if you're trying to help a company that's just larger, established, teams are more defined, you're having them move to the left, obviously, shifting to the left. Do you see any certain challenges, obviously, in terms of obviously speed might be a concern, but what specific challenges are you seeing in that case?
With larger organizations, there are two aspects. One is for at least the larger organizations that I've worked with, a lot of time what ends up happening is the culture within the organization is also different. So, for example, a larger organization may end up purchasing a smaller size organization or a medium sized organization. But what it also does is purchase the culture of that organization. Why that is important is because you may have a nimble mindset in a smaller organization, which is getting purchased by a bigger organization, which has a little bit of a slower moving culture. So in my head, it is definitely one of the considerations that the business people need to consider while making the acquisition is what is going to be the model for integrating an acquisition into the culture of the bigger organization, right? And it doesn't mean that the big organization has the better culture. It can be either way around. But from a security perspective, one of the challenges that comes in is basically communication. Like if you're working for a company which is like 10,000 strong or 100,000 strong, it's very difficult to get your message out to all of the different business units. And it definitely takes time to build the credibility as well. So you definitely need to have something like a BISO who would be working actively with the different business units. And once the strategy is laid out, that needs to be communicated over again with not just the C-level executives, but even at the ground level with the engineers, so that you have both a top-down driven message and also a bottoms-up approach to be able to get the message across. So in a small sentence, the key there is communication and more communication.
I guess you recently started at American Family Insurance, and I'm always curious when somebody starts a new role when they get in there. Obviously, they have to adjust, but you're the director of DevSecOps. How did you structure, your first 90 days? Obviously, you're getting in there, you're trying to make a change. Was there an existing team already? Was this a new team? Was it a team you inherited, and you're obviously there to kind of maybe shift in a different direction?
Yeah, so the security team at American Family is being rebuilt. So, what happened in the past few years has been that American Family Insurance has been growing, and a lot of this growth has come through acquisitions. Now, as I mentioned earlier, the culture is definitely one big part of it because when you acquire organization, you're acquiring the people, you're acquiring the culture, and you're acquiring the tooling also, and the decisions that have been made, which may or may not be fitting in to the bigger enterprise strategy that you're looking at. So all these things need to be considered. And specifically from where we are basically rebuilding the whole program. This is not to say that the program that was existing earlier was not correct. At that time, for that level of growth, it was appropriate. But as we increase our aspiration and aspire to be one of the big top companies out there. Right now, we're in the Fortune 200 or 300, and we definitely, aim to go higher up. So it's very important to have your strategy aligned, right? When you're working towards enterprise transformation, and you definitely need to have security aligned with that. So from my team's perspective, it was a combination of both. So we had some aspects of the application security program. You have your basics, which as a leader, I've done it multiple times in multiple places, building the basics. But what we had at American Family were some of the basics which were covered and some of the basics which needed to be put in. That's basically what I'm working on. The first 90 days included building the strategy of basically where we see ourselves from a 3 or 4 year perspective, understanding where the company wants to go, and then basically aligning those goals with the security goals to define the roadmap. So this would include the people strategy, this includes the tooling strategy, it includes some of the key movers, as we call it, to demonstrate that we've made progress, and then basically hiring the right talent, right? And as most leaders in the space are aware, it's talent is always the tough one. It's firstly to acquire the right talent, and secondly to make them stay.
Yeah, talent and security. Obviously, I think there's plenty of articles always written every year at some point to make mention of the 2 million deficit in terms of headcount that's needed. Let me ask you a question about that. And I'm asking a lot of security leaders the same question, just because I think hiring talent, retaining talent, that is such a one side conversation of a security professional. The other side is actually the mental health side, right? And the reason I bring that up is there's a lot of jobs that are stressful. In security, there's never a done. Like even if you launch a product tomorrow, as you mentioned, there's a potential security vulnerability just waiting to be exploited. It's never ending. You can't, even when you sleep, somebody's working against you. So I guess what's interesting, maybe from my perspective, is from the mental health standpoint, like, what are your thoughts? Like, I mean, I don't hear it being talked about, but maybe you hear it being talked about or being addressed out there.
That's a very interesting point that you bring up. So, from a mental health perspective, there are two things. One is, like you correctly mentioned, it's, you're basically waiting for the bomb to explode, right? And that particularly makes CISO jobs very stressful. And I don't know about the entire country, but in Silicon Valley, the CISO lifespan at role is also significantly shorter than other C-level executives that are out there. The important thing is to set the expectation upfront when a CISO comes in and basically have that cascade to the entire organization about what it is that we are trying to do. What is the risk tolerance? Because at the end of the day, it's basically all about risk. We cannot eliminate 100% of the risk. And whether it makes sense to even eliminate 100% of the risk, because you can eliminate like high and critical risk. But from a ROI perspective, would you wanting to be investing towards eliminating every single risk at the cost of slowing down the product development and basically innovation? So once that is established, you definitely go on the next level, which is basically hiring the different individuals with the right expectations. Now, while you did touch upon some of the aspects, which is around, basically being available all of the time, those things can be mitigated to a certain extent by having proper planning. Like, for example, most of the bigger organizations have a SOC team, which is 24 by 7. The SOC teams for mature organizations have a level one, level two analysts, and their roles are pretty well defined, and the shifts are also well defined. So if there is an incident that is happening, you basically hand that off to the next person, and there are protocols for that, and then so on and so forth. Yes, it does mean that the security leader at the top of the chain, there is constant crisis that may be happening. But then if there is constant incidents that are happening, then there is something fundamentally wrong which needs to be changed anyway.
Interesting. That's a good perspective, I think, because I think business leaders or people just with a lot of meetings always, you question, why do you need all the meetings? Why do you need that stress if you're not managing or you don't have the right delegations? I think your response is, if you have the right structure of a team set up, the right people to delegate to kind of mitigate what you know is coming, that should take a little bit of, some of that edge off of the pressure, for the directors, the CISOs of the company, where, obviously they're responsible for the overall security program.
Yeah, and it's also about setting expectations upfront, right? What I've realized is most people are resistant to change, right? But what happens when you make change as the norm? So you may find there are people who actually like changes very often, and they're looking at what is the next exciting thing, and you know that's mostly because they're very passionate. So you need a way to have a culture in an organization where you actually reward that instead of basically raising fire or raising hell every time an incident happens. You know, and things like, let's say, meditation or basically calming the mind definitely go a long way in ensuring this, although it's harder to do at an organization level and enforce that. But a lot of companies that I've worked with, they actually encourage some of these programs, and they have yoga practitioners teaching. And it's mostly, you're not forced to join those things, but if you do, then it's definitely helpful, so it's encouraged.
I actually interviewed a guy from Calm. They have a mental health app, and we were talking about some of the use cases. And it's amazing how that has just exploded into everyone's trying to find a way to not actually be stressed. And a lot of the ways you find out to not be stressed is sometimes using the phone, which is kind of interesting. But I guess a question for you, and I ask this because you've been at some very nice organizations. Now that you look back and you obviously are always adding to your toolbox, what are the couple things that you've kind of seen that are some of the core of successful security programs? I mean, you've seen this now at 6, 7 organizations. Is there any trend? Is there any consistent identifying markers that you've seen for a very healthy and good security program?
I think having a vision of the program is very important, right? And I know it's being talked about a lot, and I've heard people say that it's overrated. But I honestly believe that having the right vision goes a long way. And what I mean by that is not just having an isolated vision by the security leader, but basically understand the overall company vision and the mission, what the company is trying to do, and then align the security organization vision with the main company vision. Because you may have a vision to be the best security team, but if the organization vision is not on that, then you're basically setting yourself up for failure. So once you have the vision aligned, you basically need to cascade down, like as a security leader, as a CISO, how you define your organization structure and how the vision that the CISO puts in basically translates into mini vision for each of the different pillars of the security program. And that essentially cascades down to longer roadmap projects for each of the different organizations and so on and so forth. So at the ground level, every security engineer who's working on projects, and when I say projects, I don't mean the regular day-to-day run the business kind of thing. What I mean, the big long-term projects should be aligned to the bigger vision of the security organization, and which in turn should be aligned to the vision of the organization. And every engineer needs to understand how the linkage happens in order to make the difference, because we don't want to be checking the boxes. We want to be serving a higher purpose.
Awesome, man. Awesome. I definitely want to thank you for coming on and kind of sharing your viewpoints and some of your thoughts on these issues. So I appreciate it. If somebody wants to reach out to you with a follow up, is LinkedIn, Twitter, is there a preferred social medium that we can have people reach out to you?
Yeah, LinkedIn is pretty active on LinkedIn.
Awesome. So we'll include that in the show notes so that if anyone has a follow up question on any of your thoughts or they just want to reach out and connect with you, we'll make sure that's included. Again, thank you very much. I really enjoyed the conversation. We'll be back again next week with a different episode, different guest, always looking for topics. So I know if you're a security professional and there's an idea or thought that you'd like us to kind of cover in a podcast, love to hear those. Please subscribe to the podcast. That's one of the best things you can do. Obviously, the more people will be exposed to it that way. Until next week, thank you.
Thanks, Amir. It was nice having these discussions with you and looking forward to hearing the next podcast.